Do you ever dream about finding an abandoned house in the woods full of mysterious objects? Well, during COVID, I purchased a house on a hill filled with the entire contents of another person's life. All the artifacts of a life lived from the now deceased yet mysterious George. The house was overflowing with old letters, oracle decks, and 1,000 books with themes such as ritualistic magic, the paranormal, telepathy, and the occult. Curiosity in overdrive, I scoured through his objects, becoming like an archaeologist discovering Tutankhamun's tomb or a forensic detective without an actual murder. Intent on discovering who George was and why, as I peel back layer upon layer of his life, his fascination with religion, UFOs, and psychic phenomena seemed to trigger strange coincidences, causing the boundaries between two very different lives to become blurred. And then, visitors began reporting spirit activity in the house. Hello, my name is Micah Kopp. Welcome to the very first episode of I'm Curious About George, a true story of stumbling upon a unique house, the secret life of its objects, and the haunting beauty of what remains of a life lived. I truly wonder if George didn't lead me here. And that is something we are sure to explore. So you may ask, what is this podcast all about? Is this a ghost story? Kind of, but not in any traditional way. I'm not carrying around flashlights at midnight calling into the dark. This feels more visceral and personal. You'll not hear screaming either unless we're screaming laughing. Has there been a UFO or UAP sighting here? Not that I know of, but there's some interesting details that need further exploration. This story really taps into a very American mythos, the idea of an abandoned house and the person or people who vanished from it, or a ghost town and its folklore, a time capsule, or a treasure found. And these fascinations become like a metaphor in examining one's own life. And lastly, what is a fairy tale without magic? Magic surrounds this story and is the unexplainable glue that fuses all its varied elements together. So let me start by pressing the rewind button, coaxing us back in time just a little bit. Before I bring you into the story of George's house, I want to land on where this story begins, and that is when I sold my historic landmark in Los Angeles. I'd been living in and working out of this charming and distinguished trolley power station built in 1906. I'd created a unique home there for my son Anton and I, and our dog Lars, and a chicken named Henrietta. This beautiful brick building had become, in a way, my identity and a form of self-expression. I loved working with friends on designing and building key elements, such as an 8-foot round chandelier on a hydraulic lift, a hanging piece of raw-edged sequoia wood that acted as the counter in the kitchen, a chicken coop built to look like an airstream, and a large fountain filled with koi, which was the focal point of the garden. These elements just added more character to a beautiful building that filmmakers and event planners loved booking. Our lives there had been so unique and interesting that I never thought in my wildest dreams I would ever end up selling that building and leaving. It was so full of not only its own history, but also the history and stories that we created there. Just before I bought the building, films like Secretary with Maggie Gyllenhaal and James Spader and Catwoman were filmed there. When I was in the process of buying the substation, the romantic comedy Must Love Dogs with John Cusack was being filmed there. In the film, John Cusack has an obsession with the movie Dr. Zhivago. Ironically, I too had a romantic leaning towards this film, so much so that a few years before, I had named our family dog Omar Sharif, who is the swarthy Egyptian star of Dr. Zhivago. You'll soon learn that synchronicity seems to follow me like a dog follows scent. It was really such an interesting time. We met wonderful people like Mark Ruffalo, the actor who starred in the movie The Kids Are Alright, and filmed the restaurant scenes of that movie at the substation. He was so kind and insisted on using my son as an extra. When they filmed True Blood there, I had to send my pets away for a few days to keep them safe. And when they returned, they could smell the presence of the wolves and completely freaked out. A great memory I have was during the filming of Wine Country, hearing the beautiful voices of Maya Rudolph, Amy Poehler, and Rachel Dratch singing and harmonizing outside my kitchen door. It felt as if we were turned back in time, a knitting circle of powerful women using their voices for connection. My friend, the renowned sculptor Christopher Sladoff, for many years had his art studio on site at the substation. It was here that the iconic science fiction writer Ray Bradbury would regularly come to visit a stunning, larger-than-life sculpture Chris was sculpting based on two Bradbury characters. The first was the illustrated man from the short story of the same name, whose body was covered with magical tattoos that came to life at night to tell stories. But the tattoos also had a prophetic and dangerous power. One of the sculpted tattoos included an astronaut who had my logo for the Huron substation on the sleeve of his spacesuit. The second character that this sculpture was based on was Mr. Electrico from the story Something Wicked This Way Comes, based on a very real memory that Ray had of meeting a circus sideshow magician named Mr. Electrico, who used an electric chair and a Tesla coil to make electricity flash out of his body. The performer touched the young Bradbury on each shoulder and then his nose with a sword and said, "Live forever." Hey, didn't I tell you there was going to be some magic here? It was that moment that inspired Bradbury to chase after his passions and realize his life's calling. A few days later, he began to write and continued to write every single day. So why am I telling you all of this? To convey how hard it was to let go of that whole life. But I felt a strong pull to move on and have my son move on. At some point in 2020, after feeling like I'd been constantly working, cleaning, fixing, restoring, problem solving, etc., the words of my mother literally commenting on her deathbed that if I continued to work so hard, things would not end well. My mother had planted the seed of an idea which had begun to sprout. So I flirted with the idea of selling the property, and after some research realized that the building had more value than I had initially guessed. A few months later, I put this historic landmark and what had been my life for over 15 years up for sale. After such a big and rather vulnerable life decision, boom, COVID hit. And everyone was affected in ways that were completely unpredictable, as was I. COVID seemed to sabotage any possibility of a sale, and I just had to sweat it out with little business and tons of bills. I was tap dancing between potential buyers trying to take advantage of COVID and lowball a sale, and knowing that I had to hold out as this was my one big poker hand, and I had to play it correctly. Finally, about a year later, I was in the process of closing in on the sale of the building to the actor Alden Ehrenreich, who was going to turn the place into a production studio and a theater. It was then that I felt compelled to purge myself of much of my belongings and furniture, shedding my skin, so to speak. My son had just moved out into his own apartment, and as a single mom of one child, it was a great time and opportunity for me to completely reset my life. As I began to look for the signs of where my new chapter was to begin, and COVID kept me rather isolated, I spent a lot of time taking long drives and exploring places outside of LA where I might want to land. I also took a number of trips where I welcomed getting lost. On one such trip, on a whim, I ended up driving up a mountain road, chasing a strange ad for an unusual building for sale. The place, aside from its Mediterranean vibe, looked like something out of a fairy tale. It was perched on a lone hill with a stone facade and with a round tower at the front entrance. That, by the way, currently houses a little bird I like to call Rapunzel. The place made quite an impression, and the house was also situated on land, like all the land in this area, that was the land of the Chumash Native Americans. It had these huge wooden gates that, when closed, could have held back an army of soldiers on horses. And everywhere there was the sound of birds screeching, chirping, and cooing. The house had so many windows that when inside, due to the fact that it was high on a hill, you could see large raptors such as hawks and buzzards majestically fly right by the building at eye height. It was surreal. I was so moved by my visit to this place that my eyes welled up with tears and the hair on the back of my neck rose and made me shiver. It was as if I couldn't even control my emotions. As I left the house, I was immediately overcome by a feeling of sadness because I knew it would be a very hard place to buy, and there were so many people ahead of me. So here I need to offer a disclaimer for what comes next. It requires an open mind from both you and me. That night, when I returned to Los Angeles, I was trying to relax. I had so many things I was juggling, and I was completely overwhelmed. I had been using meditation to calm myself, and it was also helping me to make decisions. As I began to focus in on meditating, I immediately had this vision. In this vision, I saw a half man, half falcon flying over the property I had just seen while eyeing me from the sky. This was so strange. And know that I hesitate mentioning this part of the story because I feel people might judge me or consider this to be an exaggeration. Well, it was quite real, and that was just the beginning. Every few days, this vision would continue and interact with me more and more. Falcon Man, as I came to refer to him, would be flying over the property or walking on a ridge. Each time I saw him, he would point to certain parts of the property and then fly away. A few days later, again while I was meditating, I saw a number of falcon men stacked like soldiers in lines of defense on the driveway. Their feathered wings were folded in front of them, and like a game of Space Invaders, they slid back and forth, blocking strangers as they tried to walk up the driveway. They were blocking people trying to get to the house. However, as I walked up the driveway, they opened up their line of defense, and they did not block me. They let me through. I wanted to tell a number of people about this vision/experience and the feelings that it was connecting me to this property felt sort of bizarre. Of note, I had put an offer in on the property, and a few days later, the seller accepted someone else's offer. But for some reason, I was still fully intrigued and engaged, and I kept contacting my real estate agent to keep checking in to see if the sale was going through. I was beginning to feel like I was being guided to hang in there. One morning while meditating, yep, I sound so California, sorry, I had another vision. And can I just say, when I had these visions, it was like me sitting on a couch, stressed out of my gourd, trying desperately to clear my head via meditation. And while doing that, trying to keep my mind a blank screen. Suddenly, as if it was a commercial break, the Falcon Man would fly through my meditation like, we interrupt this programming with a very important message. This time, however, there were many falcon men with great pale wings flying over the property. Suddenly, in unison, they began shedding their feathers like a beautiful snowfall. It looked so celebratory in nature. I somehow knew in my heart that I was going to be able to buy this property, even though I was assured that the buyers would close within just a couple of days. And I understood that they passed all of their inspections and all the hoops one has to jump through when buying a house. I immediately called my real estate agent and begged her to call the seller's agent and find out if the sale went through. I insisted that I felt I knew their deal fell through and was at a loss to explain why I was feeling that way. With hesitation, my agent agreed to call the seller's agent again and then called me right back and said, "Are you sitting down?" And I said, yes. And she said, "I've got goosebumps on my arms. You're right. Their deal fell through." And I want to say I couldn't believe it, but I sort of could believe it, but I was just unbelievably amazed. And so to re-engage my offer, I suggested that due to the death of the previous occupant and the family being overwhelmed with all the stuff inside, I'd be interested in buying the house as is, with everything inside. Nothing needed to be cleaned, etc. This meant furniture, books, old watches, dishes, letters, photo albums, linens, and every kitchen gadget known to mankind. Well, I had just purchased a house full of another person's life after shedding much of my own. I need to rewind this story just a little bit more. In a way, you could say that this story starts earlier in my life. You see, I seem to have an interesting relationship with buildings and their legacies. While I mentioned my living in the historic landmark, the Huron Substation in Los Angeles, there were other buildings previous to that. In the 1980s, I lived in New York City, and one of the many apartments that I lived in happened to previously have been inhabited by Deborah Harry, leader of the punk rock band Blondie. Rumor had it that she and partner and band member Chris Stein had lived in this 5-story walk-up and at some point accidentally set fire to the kitchen. Because the floor must have been quite charred, rather than removing the damaged floor, the landlord built another floor above the kitchen floor, thereby reducing the height from floor to ceiling. The ceiling was so low that when my roommates and I, all three of us pretty tall, were cooking in the kitchen, we'd hit our head on the ceiling all the time, at which point we'd either curse Blondie or make jokes about her. By the way, Blondie did a great cover version of Ring of Fire. In the 1990s, when I first moved from New York to Los Angeles, I rented a huge, somewhat beat-up mansion in Pasadena and just got a number of roommates to share the rent. The place had 11 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a pool, and a butler's staircase. We found out that this had been the chef Julia Child's childhood home after witnessing a news crew film a little blurb out on the front lawn about the history of the house. By the way, say Julia Child's childhood home 3 times quickly, because it's a mouthful. We wondered where in the yard Julia had buried the chandeliers that she had supposedly stolen from neighbors, as per her autobiography. I remember that we took a shovel to a couple of corners of the yard, but we didn't find anything. I also executive produced and art directed a low-budget film that we shot at the house called Flesh Suitcase. In my final years there, I became pregnant and planned on having my baby in a birthing clinic. But life had another plan, and I accidentally gave birth to my son, Anton, on the bathroom floor with no one else there but my friend's dog, Apu. Someone showed up about 10 minutes later to help, and I had to hold both my baby and the dog's collar to prevent the dog from lunging at my savior, as the dog had become so protective of me and my newborn. We wrapped the umbilical cord with a string from a child's toy, and then we cut the cord with a Swiss Army knife from a keychain. And as we headed out, loyal and beloved Apu jumped out of a first-story window into the car and onto my lap alongside my brand new baby. I guess, in a weird way, I left a bit of my own legacy in that house. After a couple of years, we all left that home because the city wanted to build a highway where the house was. So I drove around with my now toddler in the back seat, trying to figure out where we would land next. I was planning on buying my very first small home. I saw a sign on the roadside about a house for sale with simply a phone number of a lawyer. I called it. There were 2 tiny cottages on a hillside, which was ideal because I had my mother living with me, helping me to care for my son. It turned out that the previous owner had, just like many of my dearest friends, passed away from AIDS. He also happened to be from Germany, which is the country I was born in. And so his family, not knowing American customs, had a lawyer just put a for sale sign on the road rather than formally listing it. I immediately fell in love with this property. The property, it turns out, was the location of a film production company. More specifically, a gay porn film production company with the name Black Forest Films. Sorry, I kid you not. The name of the production company was Black Forest Films. Oh my God. So you can use your clever imagination to figure out what that was about. And I can tell you, of the many themed rooms in the house, my mother chose Vietnam for her bedroom. It had bamboo wallpaper. I'm sorry. It had bamboo wallpaper and bamboo wood frames around the windows. This place had also the lingering imprint of many other humans and their activities. I found celluloid film behind one of the houses and pamphlets for Black Forest Films in the shed and even in the bushes. And the mail I got for years was amazing. Also, often, late at night, many a male partier would just show up thinking that this was still Party Central, only to disappointingly find a single mom, her toddler, and her German-speaking mother, which many people thought was the previous owner's mother due to the German accent. So I hope I've validated that I have an unusual compass that leads me to unique buildings. Maybe this is a part of my life's destiny. So when I finally managed to purchase this property with the help of these bizarre visions, I wasn't even thinking about all the items inside. I mean, I had just shed my skin, i.e. much of my furniture and clothing, and was prepared to become a butterfly. Instead, I might have become a hermit crab living inside the abandoned shell of a snail. I found myself with much more than I bargained for, the entire contents of someone else's life. After I bought the house and got the keys and found myself for the first time alone there, the first thing I really noticed was that as you walked through the front door, there were 2 items displayed with great pride. One was a PhD in divinity from an Ivy League school, and the second was a certification for becoming a pastor. So interesting. There were also George's dishes, silverware, a collection of Casio watches, Beds, linens, bureaus, lights, dressers, boxes of pictures, letters, even the lock of a loved one's hair. All of these objects seem to carry the presence of George. My sense of smell is very strong, and I could smell George lingering in every chair, pillow, and blanket in the house. And each house really does have its own identifying smell. And I could smell the presence of another person here. It was not it certainly was not a blank slate. Let's put it that way. Then I realized that there were almost 1,000 books on the shelves. And as I walked by 12 floor-to-ceiling bookcases, I started with the Bibles on one end of the room, of which there were many, and then the books on Christian history and books on religion. And as I walked further south in the building, these subjects began to shift. The subjects really surprised me. There were books about ritualistic magic, the occult, psychic phenomena, UFOs, mediumship, remote viewing, even a book on exorcisms, which makes a great coffee table book, I might add. There were so many questions reverberating in my mind. Did George leave one day, headed to the hospital, thinking he would return? Clearly, George's background and his studies and work related so profoundly to Christianity. And I wondered, how did George get from God to UFOs and magic? Oh, do you hear that sound? That is the sound of my cuckoo clock. That sound is telling me that it's time to end episode 1. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you find this episode intriguing, entertaining, and worthy. Please subscribe, like, follow, review. It helps so much, especially when you're starting a podcast. I'd like to thank Christina Lopez, who has both encouraged me and brainstormed ideas with me, and whom I hope will be a regular guest on this series. Thank you for watching.